In the heart of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire, vast and imposing, stood as a monument to human ambition, stretching from the windswept coasts of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Arabia. Yet beneath the grandeur, a storm brewed, a convergence of crises that would test the resilience of Rome in ways never before witnessed. This was an era marked by turbulence, where emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, their reigns often measured in months rather than years, and where the shadows of external threats loomed as large as the fractures within the empire itself. Among these emperors was Valerian, a man whose name would become synonymous with one of Rome's most ignominious chapters. Valerian, born into a noble lineage, had been groomed for leadership in a world where military prowess and political acumen were inseparable. His ascent to the purple was not meteoric, but it was inevitable, shaped by decades of service to the empire and by a reputation for discipline and decisiveness. He took the imperial throne in a period that historians later dubbed the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when Rome's borders were under constant pressure, its economy strained, and its very identity threatened by internal division and relentless foreign aggression. It was a world where the fate of a single emperor could ripple through provinces and frontiers, where a single misstep might invite catastrophe. Valerian's early years as emperor were marked by a determined effort to stabilize the empire, to project the image of a ruler capable of command both in the Senate and on the battlefield. He reorganized the administration, reinforced key fortifications along the Rhine and Danube, and sought to secure the loyalty of his generals. Yet even as he worked to strengthen Rome from within, the empire's enemies were stirring. The Sassanid Empire of Persia, a formidable power to the east, had begun to assert itself with growing audacity. Its leader, Shapur was a strategist of unparalleled skill and ambition, determined to expand his dominion at Rome's expense. The tension between these two great powers was not merely political, it was existential, a collision of empires whose clash would resonate for centuries. The first confrontations between Rome and Persia during Valerian's reign revealed the starkness of the challenge. Shapur's forces, disciplined and mobile, moved with a precision that Roman armies, accustomed to conventional campaigns, found difficult to counter. Cities and fortresses that had long been considered secure were suddenly vulnerable, and the threat of invasion loomed not just along the frontier, but deep into the provinces themselves. Valerian, understanding the stakes, resolved to lead personally, to marshal his legions and confront the Persian advance with the full weight of imperial authority. It was a decision that, at first glance, seemed both necessary and courageous, a hallmark of Roman tradition, where emperors were expected to lead in battle, to embody the strength of the state through personal presence on the field. As Valerian prepared for the campaign, the logistics alone were staggering. Moving tens of thousands of troops, securing supply lines and maintaining communication across deserts and mountains required meticulous planning. Roman legions were formidable, their discipline renowned, but even the most disciplined soldiers could be tested by distance, heat, hunger, and the cunning of an enemy who knew the terrain intimately. In those months, Valerian's attention to detail reflected not only his training, but his understanding that the survival of the empire depended on precision, foresight, and unyielding determination. He moved with the confidence of an emperor accustomed to command, yet the challenges he faced were unlike those confronted by his predecessors. The Persian army, in contrast, was fluid and adaptive. Shapur, inheriting a legacy of military innovation from his father Ardashir, understood that brute force alone would not suffice. His strategy was rooted in mobility, intelligence, and psychological warfare. Raids into Roman territories, coupled with diplomacy designed to sow division, tested the resolve of Roman governors and generals. Shapur's reputation grew not only from battlefield victories, but from the perception that he could anticipate his adversary's moves, striking at the precise moment when Rome's vulnerabilities were greatest. For Valerian, the challenge was daunting. He faced an enemy who was not merely strong but shrewd, a general who understood the calculus of war in ways that few Roman commanders had encountered before. As the campaign began, the initial encounters were cautiously optimistic. Roman legions advanced, fortified positions were strengthened, and Valerian's presence inspired confidence among troops and civilians alike. Yet the reality of warfare soon asserted itself. Harsh terrain, logistical delays, and persistent harassment by Persian cavalry tested the cohesion of the Roman army. Reports from the front conveyed both minor victories and troubling setbacks, a pattern that highlighted the unpredictable nature of the conflict. Valerian, though steadfast, could not ignore the signs that the campaign was more perilous than anticipated. Each engagement, each maneuver, became a complex calculation, a balance between aggression and caution, ambition and prudence. Behind the scenes, the political dimension of Valerian's struggle was equally fraught. Rome's Senate, often skeptical of imperial strategies, watched anxiously, debating whether the emperor's focus on the east was prudent. Governors and generals, some ambitious and others wary, weighed their loyalties, aware that the tides of fortune could shift with alarming speed. The empire's stability, always precarious, depended on a delicate equilibrium of authority, persuasion, and coercion. Valerian, aware of these pressures, sought to maintain unity, understanding that a fractured leadership would be as dangerous as the Persian threat itself. By the time the Roman forces approached the western regions of Mesopotamia, the situation had become critical. Skirmishes intensified, supply lines were stretched thin, and the Persian army's mastery of the terrain became increasingly apparent. The once confident forward momentum of the Romans slowed under the weight of logistical strain and the unrelenting pressure of an enemy who avoided direct confrontation when it suited him, choosing instead to exploit weaknesses and provoke attrition. Valerian, seasoned and disciplined, recognized the danger, yet he also knew that retreat or indecision could be interpreted as weakness, both by his enemies and by the people of Rome. The stakes were existential. The outcome of this campaign could redefine Rome as eastern frontier and determine the fate of its emperor. As the Roman legions pressed deeper into Mesopotamia, the landscape itself seemed to conspire against them. Arid plains stretched for miles, broken only by narrow river valleys and the occasional oasis, while scorching days and bitter nights drained both men and beasts. Supply wagons creaked along primitive roads, their wheels threatening to collapse under the relentless sun, and soldiers, despite the discipline instilled by centuries of training, began to falter under the cumulative stress. Disease and exhaustion shadowed every march, a silent adversary that no sword could strike down. Valerian, ever aware of the stakes, rode among his troops, his presence a mixture of reassurance and command, but even he could not fully shield them from the unyielding hardships of the campaign. Shapur, in contrast, observed from the vantage of a master tactician. He had chosen not to meet Rome in a single decisive engagement, but rather to draw the legions into a landscape where their strengths were muted and their weaknesses amplified. His cavalry, swift and merciless, harassed the Roman flanks, cutting off supply lines and ambushing small detachments. At night, scouts reported movements of Persian forces that vanished as quickly as they appeared, sowing confusion and eroding morale. The psychological toll of being pursued and outmaneuvered was palpable. Roman commanders, trained for set-piece battles on familiar terrain, struggled to anticipate the next move of an enemy who played a far subtler game. Valerian, despite decades of military experience, could sense that he was being drawn into a trap that might not reveal itself until it was too late. The campaign's turning point came in the vicinity of Edessa, a city whose strategic position made it both a prize and a potential death trap. The Romans needed to secure the city to establish a reliable base for further operations, yet Shapur had fortified the surrounding territory with hidden contingents and hidden supply caches. Valerian advanced cautiously, aware of the potential for ambush, yet the pressures of imperial expectation demanded action. Reports from scouts indicated that Persian forces were massing nearby, but the intelligence was fragmented, conflicting, and in some cases deliberately misleading. Shapur's mastery of subterfuge became evident in these moments. By controlling what Rome could see, he manipulated the emperor's decisions, turning caution into vulnerability. When the two armies finally confronted one another, the battle did not unfold as either side might have anticipated. The Persians, rather than launching a full assault, employed a combination of harassment, entrapment, and attrition. Roman formations, disciplined and formidable, found themselves isolated, their cohesion threatened by terrain and constant pressure. Supply shortages became critical. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers, undermining their capacity for endurance, while disease spread in the crowded camps. Valerian himself took measures to maintain order, instituting strict rationing and medical oversight. Yet even an emperor's authority could not eliminate the cumulative effects of exhaustion. Morale, once a steadfast pillar of Roman military power, began to waver under the relentless stress. Shapur capitalized on every weakness. He executed a series of maneuvers that encircled Valerian's forces, cutting off retreat and forcing the Romans into positions that offered no natural advantage. His cavalry struck swiftly at the flanks, and siege engineers worked in tandem to destabilize fortified positions. What might have been a minor engagement escalated into a perilous standoff, where each day of inaction magnified the peril. Roman historians would later describe the scene with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Legions, the embodiment of discipline and order, reduced to a desperate struggle for survival in a hostile land, unable to advance or withdraw without risking annihilation. Amid this tactical quagmire, Valerian faced a dilemma both personal and political. To abandon the field would be to acknowledge vulnerability, to undermine not only his authority, but the very prestige of the emperor's office. To press forward was to risk total destruction. The calculus of leadership became agonizingly precise. Every decision carried the weight of the empire, every misstep amplified by the relentless eyes of both ally and adversary. In private councils, Valerian's generals debated furiously, offering conflicting strategies, retreat, negotiation, or a desperate offensive, yet none could fully grasp the scope of Shapur's trap. The emperor, known for his decisiveness, was forced into a precarious balancing act, where caution and action were intertwined in a deadly paradox. As weeks dragged on, the Romans' situation deteriorated further. Water sources became scarce, and the heat of Mesopotamia combined with inadequate provisions to sap both strength and spirit. Desertion, rare in the disciplined Roman army, began to appear, as soldiers succumbed to the relentless pressures of survival. The psychological weight of being surrounded, with no apparent path to safety, gnawed at the troops. Valerian, aware of the creeping despair, employed every means at his disposal to maintain cohesion. Speeches to inspire courage, demonstrations of discipline, and personal oversight of camp organization. Yet even these measures could not entirely counter the strategic advantage that Shapur had engineered. The emperor's resolve was immense, but the forces arrayed against him were not merely physical. They were tactical, psychological, and environmental. The moment of crisis approached with terrifying inevitability. Persian forces, having gradually tightened the cordon around the Romans, launched coordinated assaults aimed less at annihilation than at containment and exhaustion. The Romans, trapped by terrain and logistics, fought with valor, but every counterattack revealed the fragility of their position. Commanders were killed or wounded, communications broke down, and the chain of command frayed under the relentless pressure. Valerian's personal courage became legendary in these moments. He remained at the center of the struggle, rallying his men even as the world seemed to narrow to the horizon of conflict around him. Yet courage, for all its nobility, could not substitute for the strategic dominance that Shapur had established. When the final encirclement was complete, the Roman army faced a stark choice: to fight to the death in hopeless defiance, to attempt a desperate and perilous breakout, or to surrender under terms that might preserve lives at the cost of honor. Valerian, weighing the stakes, chose the path that would forever mark his name in history. Faced with the overwhelming mastery of the Persian commander, with his legions exhausted, weakened, and surrounded, he surrendered. The decision shocked the Roman world. Never before had a reigning emperor been captured alive by a foreign power, and the implications rippled through the empire like a tremor before an earthquake. Shapur's triumph was not only tactical, it was symbolic, a dramatic demonstration that even the mightiest could fall under the weight of circumstance, strategy, and fortune. The aftermath of Valerian's surrender was both harrowing and politically significant. The Persians, in a gesture that combined pragmatism and spectacle, treated him with a mixture of humiliation and strategic calculation. Accounts differ on the exact details. Some describe him paraded through Persian cities. Others emphasize the long years of captivity in which he endured unimaginable conditions. What is certain is that the event shattered the aura of invincibility that surrounded Rome's emperors. It sent shockwaves through the Senate, the provinces, and the army, raising questions about leadership, strategy, and the vulnerability of even the most disciplined forces when confronted by a masterful adversary and the unforgiving realities of war. The capture of Valerian sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the Roman world. In Rome, the news arrived like a thunderclap. Senators and citizens alike struggled to comprehend the reality. An emperor, the embodiment of Roman authority and invincibility, had been seized alive by a foreign power. Political factions, long simmering with ambition and rivalry, seized the moment to critique the leadership that had allowed such a catastrophe. Questions of competence, loyalty, and strategy dominated the imperial discourse. In the provinces, governors faced unrest, as soldiers and civilians alike grappled with the psychological blow of the emperor's capture. The perception of Roman power, carefully cultivated over centuries, was suddenly undermined, leaving a vacuum of authority that rival claimants and external enemies were quick to exploit. Meanwhile, Valerian's personal ordeal in Persian hands was both dramatic and emblematic of the era's brutal realities. Historical accounts, though often conflicting and colored by the biases of their authors, suggest that Shapur I viewed the emperor not merely as a prisoner but as a symbol of his triumph over Rome. Some reports describe Valerian enduring public humiliation, forced to witness his legion's defeat and the subjugation of cities he had sworn to protect. Other accounts speak of years in captivity, during which the emperor was reportedly treated with a combination of contempt and pragmatism, used as leverage in negotiations, propaganda, and the projection of Persian dominance. Whether through parades, displays of subjugation, or bureaucratic control, Shapur understood that the capture of a living emperor was a psychological weapon as potent as any army. The strategic implications for Rome were profound. Valerian's absence left a leadership vacuum at a time when the empire could ill afford uncertainty. His son, Gallienus, who had already been co-emperor, assumed the burden of sole command, inheriting an empire beset by crises on multiple fronts. The Rhine and Danube borders faced pressures from Germanic tribes, while in the east, the Persian threat loomed ever larger. Gallienus, though capable and energetic, confronted an unprecedented challenge, sustaining the empire's authority while managing the psychological fallout of his father's capture. The Senate, while nominally supportive, offered only fragmented counsel, reflecting the political fractures that had long complicated imperial governance. Rome's stability, once a given under the weight of centuries of tradition, now hung by a thread. For the legions that had fought alongside Valerian, the aftermath of capture was a mixture of devastation and survival. Many soldiers had been killed in the encirclement, others taken prisoner, and a significant portion scattered in the desert, their cohesion destroyed. The practical consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Supply lines had been disrupted, fortified positions abandoned, and morale shattered. For Roman military culture, which emphasized honor, discipline, and the sanctity of the emperor, the event represented both a psychological and operational catastrophe. Commanders who survived the disaster were left to reconstruct armies in the field, while provinces once secure were now vulnerable to both internal revolt and foreign incursion. Shapur's victory, in this sense, extended far beyond the immediate tactical triumph, reshaping the strategic landscape of the eastern Roman frontier for years to come. Shapur himself capitalized on the momentum. His campaign was not simply about defeating an army or capturing a single man. It was about projecting power, creating a narrative of Persian ascendancy that would resonate across the region. Cities once under Roman control were compelled to pay tribute, fortifications were reinforced under Persian oversight, and diplomatic missions were orchestrated to reinforce the image of an invincible empire in the east. By keeping Valerian alive, Shapur ensured that the psychological impact of his victory endured. Propaganda, ritual humiliation, and the careful orchestration of appearances all combined to magnify the sense of Persian dominance, demonstrating that military success alone was insufficient without the careful cultivation of perception and legitimacy. Within Rome, the debate over the emperor's fate was intense and bitter. Senators, generals, and even ordinary citizens speculated on what might have become of Valerian in captivity, with accounts ranging from respectful treatment to brutal abuse. Chroniclers such as Lactantius and later historians amplified the drama, portraying the event as both a divine punishment for hubris and a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of even the greatest powers. Religious interpretations further complicated the narrative, with Christian writers framing the emperor's capture in moral and theological terms, emphasizing human fallibility, the limits of earthly power, and the inscrutable designs of providence. Even as political leaders debated strategy, the story of Valerian became a lens through which Romans interpreted the nature of leadership, authority, and the precarious balance between ambition and prudence. Gallienus faced the enormous task of stabilizing the empire in the wake of his father's capture. His response combined military innovation with political pragmatism. He fortified frontier regions, reorganized legions to respond more flexibly to threats, and worked to rebuild trust among provincial governors and the military hierarchy. Yet the shadow of Valerian's fate loomed over every decision. Enemy forces, emboldened by the emperor's capture, tested boundaries with renewed aggression, while internal factions within the empire interpreted the event as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. Gallienus's challenge was not merely operational, it was symbolic. Every act of leadership was measured against the backdrop of the most extraordinary humiliation Rome had suffered in generations. Meanwhile, the legend of Valerian's captivity grew, blending fact and embellishment in ways that magnified its dramatic power. Stories circulated of the emperor being forced to kneel before Shapur, of being used as a human footstool or laboring in chains, and of enduring unimaginable suffering over the years. Whether fully accurate or exaggerated by later chroniclers, these tales underscored a central truth. The capture of an emperor alive was unprecedented, and its significance extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. It was a turning point, a vivid illustration that the might of Rome, though formidable, was not invincible, and that even the most carefully planned campaigns could be undone by cunning, circumstance, and the inexorable dynamics of war. For historians analyzing this period, Valerian's capture is both a cautionary tale and a window into the complexities of empire. The event illustrates the interplay between leadership, strategy, environment, and human psychology. It highlights the importance of logistics, intelligence, and adaptability in warfare, as well as the perils of overconfidence and underestimating an opponent. Equally, it underscores the symbolic power of rulers. The capture of a living emperor was not just a military victory, but a challenge to the legitimacy and authority of the Roman state itself. In every sense, the consequences of Valerian's fate rippled far beyond the battlefield, shaping the political, military, and cultural contours of the 3rd century empire. Shapur's triumph, while monumental, was not merely a fleeting episode of cruelty or spectacle. It marked a decisive moment in the ongoing struggle between Rome and Persia, a contest defined by skill, strategy, and endurance. For Valerian, the consequences were permanent. He would never return to the city that had crowned him, never again command legions on Roman soil. For Rome, the capture forced a reckoning with vulnerability, the limits of centralized power, and the necessity of innovation in the face of external threats. The emperor's personal suffering became intertwined with the fate of the state, creating a narrative that would endure in historical memory, literature, and legend. Even centuries later, scholars and storytellers alike grappled with the magnitude of what had occurred. The capture of Valerian remained singular. No other Roman emperor would be taken alive in the annals of the empire, and the event continued to resonate as both a symbol of Persian ascendancy and a stark lesson in the precariousness of power. Every decision leading up to the surrender, every tactical miscalculation, and every element of strategy can be traced with a historian's care. Yet the human dimension, the fear, courage and suffering experienced by the emperor and his legions remains an essential lens through which we understand the crisis. The drama, both strategic and personal, became inseparable from the history of the empire itself. Valerian's captivity in the heart of the Sassanid Empire unfolded as both a personal ordeal and a grand spectacle of Persian power. Shapur I, acutely aware of the political and psychological leverage afforded by holding a Roman emperor alive, orchestrated his treatment with meticulous care. Ancient sources paint a grim picture. Valerian, once the supreme authority of the greatest empire of the Mediterranean, reduced to a prisoner, a symbol of Rome's vulnerability. He was moved through the Persian cities, paraded before conquered populations, and subjected to both humiliation and control, his presence a constant reminder of Persian dominance. Even as his captors sought to break his spirit, Valerian remained an enduring emblem of Roman discipline and resolve, his dignity a quiet counterpoint to the theatrical cruelty of his captors. The Sassanid court, by contrast, celebrated the emperor's capture as a triumph of statecraft as much as of arms. Shapur understood that victories were not merely tactical, they were also narrative, shaping perceptions both within his empire and beyond. Envoys and emissaries were dispatched to announce the defeat of Rome, emphasizing the magnitude of the victory and the obedience of Valerian. Coins and inscriptions commemorated the triumph, casting the Persian king not only as a military genius, but as a ruler sanctioned by divine favor. The capture of Valerian became a defining element of Shapur's legacy, a demonstration of strategic vision, psychological insight, and administrative acumen. In the corridors of power, the event resonated as a validation of the Sassanid state's strength, its capacity to challenge the mightiest empire of the age. Rome, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to the sudden absence of its emperor. Gallienus, confronted with crises on multiple fronts, had to make rapid and innovative decisions to stabilize the empire. The Rhine and Danube borders remained under threat from Germanic and Gothic incursions, while in the east, the vacuum left by Valerian's capture emboldened Persian advances. Gallienus implemented reforms to decentralize command, granting greater autonomy to provincial generals while seeking to maintain overall cohesion. He encouraged mobility among the legions, emphasizing rapid response and flexibility, a departure from the rigid structures that had previously defined Roman military organization. In these decisions, one can trace the lessons imposed by Valerian's fate. An empire could not rely solely on tradition, hierarchy, or numerical superiority. Adaptability, intelligence, and psychological awareness were equally crucial. The social and political ramifications in Rome were profound. The capture of an emperor alive challenged the perception of imperial invincibility, shaking confidence in the office itself. Senators debated not only military strategy, but also the very nature of leadership, questioning the mechanisms of authority and succession. Regional governors, often responsible for maintaining order in distant provinces, faced uncertainty. The specter of Persian aggression and internal unrest demanded both caution and initiative. Meanwhile, the populace, reliant on the symbolism of imperial power for stability, struggled to reconcile the image of Rome's enduring grandeur with the reality of its vulnerability. Public morale fluctuated, and rumors of Valerian's treatment circulated widely, further complicating the political landscape. The experience of captivity, though undoubtedly harrowing, also highlighted the complex interplay of power, diplomacy, and survival in antiquity. Shapur's treatment of Valerian was a calculated exercise in statecraft, balancing humiliation with pragmatism. The emperor was a living proof of victory, yet also a valuable asset. His presence could be leveraged in negotiations, used to influence rebellious provinces, or displayed to intimidate other adversaries. The decision not to execute Valerian outright, though seemingly cruel in its prolongation, reflects Shapur's sophisticated understanding of the symbolic dimensions of power. By maintaining the emperor's life under controlled circumstances, the Persian king converted a tactical victory into a lasting geopolitical and psychological tool. Valerian's personal endurance, though largely obscured by the dramatized accounts of later chroniclers, becomes a testament to the human capacity to withstand adversity. While stories of humiliation, forced labor, and abuse dominate the narratives, the underlying truth is one of resilience and fortitude. He survived years in a foreign land, a captive in the heart of a rival empire, enduring conditions that would have broken lesser men. His presence in Persia, though enforced, remained a subtle assertion of Roman identity and dignity. Even as an individual, he embodied the authority, discipline, and persistence of the empire he once ruled. In this sense, the emperor's captivity was not only a defeat, but also a complex narrative of endurance and symbolism, illustrating that power extends beyond immediate control over armies or territories. The geopolitical consequences of Valerian's capture were immediate and enduring. The eastern provinces of Rome were destabilized, forcing a reconsideration of military priorities and diplomatic strategies. Gallienus, recognizing the need to secure Rome's borders against further encroachments, pursued a combination of offensive campaigns and strategic diplomacy, seeking to restore credibility while avoiding overextension. Alliances were renegotiated and legions repositioned to respond to threats with greater agility. Shapur, meanwhile, consolidated his gains, fortifying key cities and establishing networks of control that extended Persian influence into territories previously under nominal Roman authority. The balance of power in the region, long contested, shifted decisively, with Persia asserting itself as a peer to Rome rather than a peripheral threat. Within the empire, the crisis also accelerated military, administrative, and cultural transformation. Roman leadership recognized that traditional command structures and strategies were insufficient to meet the evolving challenges posed by both external enemies and internal fragmentation. The decentralization of authority, reforms in legion mobility, and emphasis on flexible command structures were all responses shaped by the lessons of Valerian's fate. Additionally, the psychological dimension of leadership gained new prominence. The importance of perception, morale, and symbolic authority became central to maintaining cohesion across a vast and diverse empire. In this way, a catastrophic event became a catalyst for evolution, reshaping Roman governance and military strategy in lasting ways. The memory of Valerian's captivity persisted in the collective consciousness of Rome and its historians. Chroniclers emphasized both the moral and strategic dimensions of the event, framing it as a cautionary tale of hubris, preparedness, and leadership under pressure. Christian writers interpreted the emperor's misfortune as divine judgment, reinforcing narratives of moral consequence and human fallibility. Military analysts, meanwhile, focused on the tactical lessons, the critical importance of intelligence, the risks of overextension, and the necessity of adaptive leadership in the face of unpredictable opponents. Across centuries, the event became a touchstone, informing how leaders, scholars, and strategists interpreted the interplay of power, strategy, and human endurance. Valerian's captivity, lasting until his death, stands as a singular episode in Roman history. No other emperor would be taken alive by a foreign power, and the psychological and strategic consequences of this unique event reverberated throughout the empire. It was a vivid illustration of the perils inherent in leadership during a period of intense geopolitical pressure, demonstrating that military skill, administrative authority, and personal courage could be rendered insufficient by circumstances, strategy, and the environment. Shapur's triumph, therefore, was both tactical and symbolic, a masterful convergence of military acumen, statecraft, and psychological insight, immortalized in the annals of history. Shapur I, having secured the unprecedented triumph of capturing a reigning Roman emperor, turned his attention to consolidating power and reinforcing the Sassanid Empire's position in the region. The victory over Valerian was more than a fleeting military success. It provided an opportunity to strengthen Persia's internal cohesion and external influence simultaneously. Within the Sassanid court, Shapur capitalized on the psychological and symbolic weight of his conquest. Nobles and military commanders were reminded of the king's strategic brilliance, while provincial governors and city leaders were instructed to honor Persian authority, not merely through obedience, but through active participation in the empire's vision. The capture of Valerian became a unifying story, a powerful narrative that reinforced loyalty and validated Shapur's overarching strategy. Strategically, Persia expanded its influence across the contested territories along the Roman frontier. Cities once considered vulnerable to Roman counterattack were fortified, trade routes secured, and supply chains strengthened. Persian control over Mesopotamia and adjacent regions became more systematic, demonstrating an understanding of the interplay between military conquest and administrative governance. Unlike Rome, which struggled with overextended frontiers and decentralized authority, the Sassanid Empire leveraged the psychological impact of Valerian's capture to stabilize newly acquired territories. Shapur's approach was both pragmatic and visionary, combining coercion, infrastructure, and political symbolism to cement Persian authority. The Romans, meanwhile, faced a dual challenge, restoring confidence within the empire and countering the threat of Persia. Gallienus, having assumed sole leadership, demonstrated remarkable adaptability under pressure. Recognizing that the old strategies had failed, he initiated military reforms, emphasizing flexibility and rapid response. He delegated greater autonomy to regional commanders, enabling them to react to threats without awaiting direct imperial approval. These changes marked a departure from the rigid hierarchy that had characterized Roman military command, reflecting a pragmatic response to an evolving strategic landscape. In this sense, Valerian's capture catalyzed institutional innovation, transforming the Roman military into a more resilient, adaptable force, capable of confronting a variety of threats across multiple fronts. The psychological impact of Valerian's fate persisted in Rome, shaping the decisions of both leaders and citizens. Public perception, always a crucial component of imperial authority, required careful management. Gallienus and his advisors emphasized continuity, stability, and resilience, seeking to counteract the demoralizing effects of the emperor's capture. Public spectacles, civic ceremonies, and proclamations of military reform were orchestrated to restore confidence. At the same time, historians, chroniclers, and religious writers interpreted Valerian's misfortune in ways that blended moral, political, and strategic lessons. Christian authors, in particular, framed the event as divine judgment, highlighting the moral dimensions of leadership and the consequences of hubris, while secular historians analyzed it as a case study in military strategy and statecraft. Shapur's treatment of Valerian also reflects the sophistication of Persian political culture. Rather than executing the emperor, a choice that might have ended the story swiftly, he maintained Valerian as a living symbol of Persian dominance. This decision was a strategic calculation. By holding a Roman emperor captive, Shapur could leverage negotiations, manipulate perceptions in the wider region, and enhance the legitimacy of his rule. Public demonstrations of Valerian's subjugation, whether accurate or exaggerated by later chroniclers, served as potent propaganda. The emperor became a living monument to Persian superiority, embodying the triumph of strategy, patience, and foresight over brute force alone. The impact of these events on the broader Roman-Persian dynamic was profound. Rome could no longer assume that its eastern frontiers were secure, nor that traditional strategies would guarantee victory. The capture of an emperor challenged centuries of military doctrine and forced a reconsideration of the balance between offensive and defensive operations. At the same time, the psychological reverberations underscored the vulnerability of centralized authority. The emperor, once the ultimate symbol of invincibility, could be seized, and the state could suffer both materially and morally as a result. Gallienus's reforms in this context reflect an acute awareness that survival depended not only on military might, but also on strategic adaptation, morale management, and institutional flexibility. The legend of Valerian's captivity, preserved in Roman and Persian sources alike, grew in magnitude over time. Chroniclers described elaborate details of humiliation, forced labor, and public display, many of which may have been dramatized to underscore the moral and strategic lessons of the episode. Yet even if some accounts were exaggerated, the core truth remained stark. The capture of a reigning emperor was unprecedented, a historic event that reshaped perceptions of power, authority, and vulnerability. For future generations, Valerian became both a cautionary figure and a symbol of endurance, embodying the consequences of misjudgment, while also reflecting the human capacity to endure unimaginable adversity. In Persia, the empire's expansion under Shapur continued beyond the immediate triumph. Fortifications were reinforced, administrative networks strengthened, and diplomatic relations recalibrated to reflect the new balance of power. The capture of Valerian was not a singular event, but a catalyst, allowing the Sassanids to consolidate territorial gains and assert themselves as a formidable rival to Rome. The strategic, psychological, and administrative dimensions of the conquest reinforced Persia's long-term resilience, ensuring that the empire would remain a central player in regional politics for decades to come. Rome's response to these challenges, meanwhile, illustrates the adaptive capacity of imperial systems. Gallienus's reforms, from military decentralization to enhanced flexibility in command, reveal an empire learning from catastrophe. Provinces were encouraged to act autonomously within broader strategic frameworks. Legions were retrained for mobility and rapid deployment, and emphasis was placed on intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. These measures, while reactive to Valerian's capture, laid the foundation for a more resilient and responsive imperial structure. The empire, though temporarily weakened, demonstrated an ability to absorb shocks, innovate, and recover, a testament to the institutional strength that had sustained Rome for centuries. The story of Valerian's capture thus operates on multiple levels. It is a tale of personal suffering, a narrative of strategic mastery, and a case study in the dynamics of power and statecraft. It illustrates the ways in which individual events can catalyze systemic change, reshaping military doctrine, political structures, and collective consciousness. The emperor's ordeal in Persia was simultaneously a personal tragedy and a transformative moment for Rome, prompting reflection, adaptation, and a recalibration of imperial priorities. Through this lens, the event transcends mere anecdote, becoming a defining moment in the history of two great empires locked in perpetual struggle. As years passed, the consequences of Valerian's capture continued to unfold. The Sassanids leveraged their advantage to consolidate authority and intimidate adversaries, while Rome grappled with both internal and external pressures, compelled to innovate in order to survive. Gallienus's reign, shaped by the shadow of his father's fate, reflected both the vulnerability and resilience of the empire. In the interplay between Persian strategy and Roman adaptation, one sees a vivid illustration of how leadership, circumstance, and strategy converge to shape historical trajectories. The capture of Valerian was not merely a singular incident, it was a turning point, with enduring ramifications, influencing military, political, and psychological landscapes across decades and generations. Valerian's final years in Persian captivity unfolded as a slow, inexorable decline, a testament to both the harshness of his circumstances and the enduring psychological weight of his defeat. The precise details of his treatment remain clouded by the inconsistencies of ancient sources, yet what emerges is a portrait of prolonged suffering, tempered by resilience. Accounts describe the emperor subjected to conditions that would have tested the limits of human endurance: chains, forced labor, and public humiliation, all under the watchful eyes of Shapur's court. In some versions, he was forced to witness his legion's defeat firsthand, a constant reminder of the power that had been wrested from him and the empire he once ruled. The image of a great emperor reduced to captivity became a powerful symbol for both Persian propagandists and Roman chroniclers, each interpreting his suffering through different lenses. For the Persians, Valerian's presence was both practical and symbolic. Shapur used the emperor to legitimize his own authority, demonstrating to allies and enemies alike that Persia could subjugate Rome's highest authority. Public displays of Valerian's humiliation, whether exaggerated or factual, reinforced the narrative of Persian supremacy and served as a warning to other potential challengers. Within the Sassanid administrative structure, this unprecedented victory strengthened Shapur's position among nobles, military leaders, and provincial governors, reinforcing cohesion and loyalty in a manner that military success alone could not achieve. The use of an emperor as a living symbol of conquest illustrates the sophistication of Persian statecraft, highlighting their ability to integrate military, psychological, and administrative strategies in pursuit of enduring dominance. Meanwhile, the story of Valerian's captivity spread across the Roman world, shaping the collective imagination. Letters, reports, and rumors reached Rome and its provinces, influencing both morale and political discourse. Gallienus, confronted with the enormity of the psychological blow, emphasized stability and continuity, taking steps to reassure the populace and the military that Rome remained resilient. Public ceremonies, proclamations, and reorganized military structures were intended to convey strength, even as the empire grappled with the stark reality that a reigning emperor had been captured alive, a humiliation without precedent. The psychological impact on soldiers and citizens was profound, challenging assumptions about invincibility and forcing reflection on the vulnerabilities inherent in imperial authority. The historical debate over Valerian's treatment in captivity also underscores the interplay of narrative and memory. Sources such as Lactantius portray him enduring extreme humiliation, suggesting he was subjected to forced labor and even death in a manner designed to demonstrate Persian cruelty. Other accounts are less dramatic, but emphasize the protracted nature of his imprisonment and the indignities he suffered. Regardless of the factual accuracy, these stories became embedded in Roman memory, serving both as cautionary tales and as moral exemplars, illustrating the consequences of misjudgment, hubris, and the perils of leadership in a world defined by relentless geopolitical competition. Valerian's death in captivity, reportedly at the hands of his captors, marks the tragic conclusion of this extraordinary narrative. The precise circumstances remain uncertain. Some sources claim he was executed after years of confinement, while others describe lingering suffering exacerbated by environmental hardship and mistreatment. The emperor's demise symbolized the irreversible consequences of military failure and strategic miscalculation, serving as a stark reminder of the stakes inherent in imperial command. For the Sassanids, his death closed the chapter on a prolonged and psychologically potent display of dominance, allowing Shapur to consolidate his gains without the complication of a living Roman emperor remaining as a symbolic counterweight. The Persian perspective on Valerian's captivity and death reflects a sophisticated understanding of historical symbolism. Shapur's victory was celebrated not merely as a battlefield conquest, but as a demonstration of statecraft, strategy, and divine favor. Coins, inscriptions, and palace narratives emphasize the subjugation of Rome and the endurance of Persian authority. The emperor's presence and eventual demise reinforced Shapur's image as a masterful strategist and ruler capable of shaping events far beyond the battlefield. The capture and control of an enemy's highest authority allowed Persia to exert influence over neighboring regions and project an aura of invincibility, illustrating how symbolic victories can complement military and administrative achievements. In Rome, the repercussions continued to unfold. Gallienus's reforms and strategic initiatives reflected lessons learned from the debacle in the East, emphasizing mobility, delegation, and adaptability in military operations. The empire's eastern frontiers were reinforced, and diplomatic initiatives sought to stabilize relations with both allies and adversaries. Valerian's capture catalyzed not only military reforms, but also institutional reflection, shaping approaches to leadership, succession, and crisis management. The incident highlighted the vulnerabilities of centralized power, demonstrating that even the mightiest of rulers could be rendered powerless under certain circumstances, and that resilience required both strategic foresight and institutional flexibility. The cultural memory of Valerian's fate persisted across centuries, influencing how historians, writers, and strategists interpreted leadership, strategy, and human endurance. His capture became a symbol of the precariousness of power, a cautionary tale illustrating that authority, however absolute in appearance, could be vulnerable to cunning, circumstance, and the unpredictable dynamics of war. At the same time, the story celebrated human endurance. Valerian's survival for years in captivity, despite humiliation and hardship, reflected a capacity for resilience that transcended mere political or military failure. This duality, tragedy and endurance, ensured that his story remained compelling in Roman memory, a narrative that combined morality, history, and human drama in a way that few other events could. The long-term implications for Rome and Persia were profound. For Persia, Shapur's triumph established a precedent in which strategic, symbolic, and psychological tools were deployed alongside traditional military conquest, enhancing the empire's ability to project power across the region. For Rome, the capture and death of an emperor necessitated strategic evolution, institutional adaptation, and renewed emphasis on the interplay between leadership, morale, and logistical capability. The empire's capacity to absorb the shock, innovate, and restore stability highlights the enduring resilience of Roman institutions, even in the face of unprecedented humiliation. Valerian's captivity, death, and legacy thus operate on multiple levels: personal, military, political, and symbolic. His story illustrates the human costs of leadership, the consequences of strategic miscalculation, and the enduring power of symbolism in the exercise of authority. Shapur's triumph demonstrates the ways in which military, political, and psychological strategies can converge to reshape regional dynamics, influence collective memory, and leave a lasting imprint on history. Across the centuries, the episode remains unparalleled, the only instance of a Roman emperor captured alive, a dramatic intersection of human frailty, imperial ambition, and geopolitical strategy, immortalized in both Roman and Persian memory. The story of Valerian's capture and ultimate demise left an indelible mark on history, reverberating through the political, military, and cultural landscapes of the ancient world. It was not merely a tale of personal tragedy, but a defining moment in the ongoing contest between two of antiquity's greatest powers. The psychological shock of a reigning emperor being seized alive resonated across the Roman Empire, challenging long-held assumptions about invincibility, authority, and the nature of leadership. For centuries, chroniclers would reflect on the episode as both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination, exploring the intersection of human frailty, military strategy, and imperial ambition in ways that transcended the immediate events themselves. In the aftermath, Rome undertook a process of both practical and symbolic recovery. Gallienus, having inherited the immense burden left by his father's captivity, demonstrated strategic acumen in stabilizing the empire. His reforms emphasized adaptability, flexibility, and decentralization, creating a military structure capable of responding to multiple, simultaneous threats. These reforms were not abstract innovations, but direct responses to the vulnerabilities exposed by Valerian's fate. By delegating authority, enhancing legion mobility, and emphasizing intelligence and reconnaissance, Gallienus mitigated the risks of overextension and surprise, ensuring that Rome could withstand both internal unrest and external aggression. In this sense, Valerian's capture acted as a catalyst for systemic evolution, transforming the Roman Empire into a more resilient and responsive entity, even amid the turbulence of the 3rd century. Culturally and psychologically, Valerian's story became a potent symbol of both caution and endurance. Chroniclers, poets, and later historians amplified the drama of his captivity, creating a narrative that blended fact and legend. Accounts of his suffering, whether through chains, forced labor, or public humiliation, underscored the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals, while simultaneously highlighting human resilience in the face of extreme adversity. Christian writers, in particular, interpreted the emperor's fate as a moral lesson, framing it as divine punishment for pride or hubris, and using it to convey broader themes of accountability, morality, and human limitation. Secular historians, meanwhile, examined the strategic dimensions, analyzing how tactical misjudgment, environmental factors, and the genius of an opponent could converge to produce catastrophic outcomes. The story, in its multiple interpretations, became a lens through which both contemporaries and later generations explored the interplay of power, leadership, and fate. For Persia, Shapur's triumph was equally transformative. The capture of Valerian solidified his reputation as a master strategist and shrewd ruler, demonstrating that military victories could be leveraged into political and symbolic capital. The Sassanid Empire emerged from the episode with enhanced prestige, territorial control, and legitimacy. By integrating the psychological impact of Valerian's captivity with effective governance, Shapur extended Persian influence in ways that reshaped the balance of power in the region. The conquest also set a precedent for the use of high-profile captives in diplomacy and propaganda, illustrating a sophisticated understanding of how the projection of power could extend far beyond conventional battlefield victories. The long-term historical consequences of this event cannot be overstated. The capture of Valerian forced Rome to rethink its military, administrative, and psychological strategies, demonstrating the limitations of traditional approaches when confronted with a cunning and adaptable adversary. It underscored the importance of logistics, intelligence, and environmental awareness in military campaigns, as well as the necessity of moral and symbolic authority in maintaining the cohesion of both army and state. Similarly, the episode reinforced the value of psychological warfare and narrative control, lessons that Persia leveraged to consolidate and expand its influence. In these dynamics, we see the enduring relevance of Valerian's fate as a case study in the convergence of leadership, strategy, and human endurance. In the centuries that followed, Valerian's capture continued to capture the imagination of historians, military theorists, and writers. The episode became emblematic of the precariousness of imperial power, demonstrating that even an emperor could be brought low by circumstance, strategy, and superior cunning. Simultaneously, it highlighted the resilience of human character, as Valerian endured years of captivity with dignity, becoming a symbol of stoic endurance in the face of humiliation. The duality of tragedy and resilience ensured that the story remained compelling, providing lessons not only in military and political strategy, but in the human experience of suffering, leadership, and legacy. For Rome, the memory of Valerian's capture informed subsequent generations of emperors and military commanders. Strategic caution, attention to supply lines, and the cultivation of intelligence networks became central considerations in campaigns, particularly along the eastern frontier. The psychological dimension of leadership, maintaining morale, projecting authority, and understanding the symbolic power of rulers, was also reinforced as a critical aspect of governance. In this way, the consequences of one catastrophic event extended far beyond the immediate influencing policy, strategy, and cultural understanding for decades. Shapur's triumph, in contrast, became an enduring element of Persian legacy. The capture of a Roman emperor alive was an unprecedented accomplishment, and the demonstration of restraint, strategy, and political acumen enhanced the Sassanid state's prestige for generations. Persia's ability to translate a single military victory into long-term influence illustrates a sophisticated approach to power, one in which tactical mastery, psychological insight, and symbolic authority were inseparable. Valerian's presence and eventual death became woven into the story of Persian ascendancy, reinforcing the notion that the empire could not only defend itself, but challenge and triumph over Rome, the preeminent power of the age. Ultimately, the story of Valerian is a narrative that operates on multiple levels: personal, military, political, and symbolic. It illustrates the fragility of authority, the consequences of misjudgment, and the enduring importance of strategic adaptability. At the same time, it highlights human resilience, the capacity to endure adversity, and the enduring power of narrative in shaping historical memory. Across centuries, the tale has inspired reflection on leadership, the nature of power, and the ways in which history is both made and remembered. Valerian, the only Roman emperor to be captured alive, remains a figure of fascination precisely because his story embodies both failure and endurance, tragedy and legacy. It is a story of an empire tested to its limits, of a cunning adversary exploiting every advantage, and of an individual confronting circumstances beyond human control with dignity and perseverance. The capture reshaped empires, influenced military doctrine, and entered the annals of history as a moment of profound consequence. A singular event, that reminds us that even the mightiest can fall, and that the measure of a ruler lies not only in victories achieved, but in endurance sustained amid overwhelming adversity. In the end, the legacy of Valerian's capture endures not only in the chronicles of Rome and Persia, but in the broader lessons it offers about leadership strategy, human resilience, and the intricate interplay of fate and decision-making in the currents of history. It remains a story that is at once a cautionary tale, a historical turning point, and a testament to the enduring complexity of human ambition and endurance.